Chapter 8, Part 1 of The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 8, Part 1. At that time of the night in which the cocks crow, a certain young man came from the next city, who appeared to me to be one of the servants of that virgin Charity, who had endured equal sorrows with myself among the robbers. He, sitting near the fire, in the company of his fellow servants, related as follows the wonderful and execrable particulars of her death, and the destruction of the whole of her house. Ye equerries, shepherds, and cowards, we have lost the miserable Charity, and by a most grievous casualty, yet she did not depart to the shades alone. But that all of you may know the particulars, I will narrate to you from the beginning what happened, and which deserves to be committed to writing in the form of a history by a more learned man, on whom fortune has conferred the ability of writing with facility and elegance. There was a young man in the next city whose name was Thrasyllus, of noble birth, an illustrious knight, and, at the same time, very rich. But he was a man addicted to the luxury of taverns, and to harlots and potations by day. On this account he iniquitously associated with the factious bands of robbers, and his hands also had been occasionally dyed with human blood. Such was the man, and such was the report concerning him. But he, as soon as Charity was marriageable, was among the number of her principal suitors, and most ardently endeavoured to obtain her in wedlock. And though he surpassed in nobility all the rest of her lovers, and solicited her parents with splendid gifts, yet he was rejected by them, on account of his morals, and suffered the disgrace of a repulse. When therefore Charity, the daughter of my master, came into the hands of the worthy Tlepolemus, Thrasyllus, though disappointed in his hopes, yet firmly cherishing his love, and mingling indignation with it, on account of his rejected suit, sought for an opportunity of perpetrating a bloody deed. At length, a seasonable occasion presenting itself, he attempted the wickedness which had for a long time been the subject of his thoughts; and, on the day in which the virgin had been liberated, by the cunning and fortitude of her spouse, from the deadly swords of the robbers, he mingled himself with the crowd of those that congratulated her, exulting in a remarkable manner, and rejoicing in the present safety and future offspring of the new married pair. Hence, being received into our house among the principal guests, as the nobility of his race demanded, he falsely assumed the person of a most faithful friend, concealing his wicked design. And now, becoming more and more dear, by assiduous narrations and frequent conversation, and sometimes also by eating and drinking with them, he unconsciously precipitated himself, by degrees, into a profound gulf of love. Nor is this wonderful, since the flame of love, at first indeed being small, delights with a tepid heat, but afterwards becoming very fierce through the excitation of familiar conversation, at length wholly burns a man with immoderate heat. Hence Thrasyllus for a long time deliberated with himself how he might find an opportune place for clandestine conference, since he perceived that he was more and more excluded from the avenues to an adulterous intercourse by the multitude of observers, and that the most firm bond of a new and increasing affection could not be dissolved; and still further, that the ignorance of Charity in the art of deceiving her husband would be an obstacle to her, even though she should be willing to gratify his passion. Notwithstanding Thrasyllus perceived all this, yet he was impelled by a pernicious obstinacy to effect that which he could not accomplish as if he could. That, however, which was now considered as difficult to be done, seemed easy to be effected when love was corroborated by time. Lastly, consider, but I beseech you attentively consider, with what violence the impetus of furious lust burst forth. On a certain day Tlepolemus went a-hunting, together with Thrasyllus, for the purpose of searching after wild beasts. If, however, there is any savageness in goats, for Charity would not suffer her husband to hunt beasts that were armed with teeth or horns. And now, near a hill abounding with leaves, and umbrageous with a thick covering of branches, the passage to the plains being enclosed with nets, through the care of the husbandman, the dogs destined to the sagacious investigation of savage animals, were sent out to attack the wild beasts which happened to be there housed in their retreats. And immediately, being mindful of their crafty art, they divide among themselves, and surround all the avenues, and, first softly murmuring, on a signal being suddenly given them, they fill every place with loud and dissonant barkings. Nor did any goat or timid deer, nor a stag, which is milder than other beasts, rise from thence; but a large boar, and such as was never before seen, rushed out, having brawny and fat thighs, covered with a callous skin, a hide squalid with rough hair, bristled with thorns rising from his spine, foaming at the mouth, grinding his teeth with a crashing noise, emitting fire from his eyes with a threatening aspect, and laying waste everything like thunder, by the savage impetus of his raging mouth. And in the first place indeed he slew the most eager of the dogs, who approached the nearest to him, lacerating them with his tusks, which he extended in all directions. Afterwards, having trampled on the nets, he ran through them, to wherever his first impetus directed him. And all of us, indeed, being seized with fear, as we had been accustomed to harmless hunting, and were then also without arms, and without any means of defence, latently concealed ourselves under the teguments of leaves or behind trees. But Thrasyllus, having found a fit opportunity of acting fraudulently, thus insidiously addressed Tlepolemus: "Why, being confused by stupor, or by vain fear, like these abject servants, or dejected by feminine terror, do we suffer so profitable a prey to escape our hands? Why do we not leap on our horses, and swiftly pursue this wild beast? Do you take a hunting spear, and I will take a lance." And, without the least delay, they immediately leapt on their horses, following with the greatest ardour the beast. But the boar, not forgetting his genuine vigour, turned back, and burning with the fire of ferocity, and grinding his teeth, considered dubiously on whom he should first rush. Tlepolemus, however, first sent his spear into the back of the beast, but Thrasyllus, sparing indeed the boar, struck with his lance, and cut off the hind legs of the horse on which Tlepolemus rode, the horse reclining to that part from which the blood flowed, and being entirely laid on his back, unwillingly threw his master to the ground. Nor was it long before the furious boar attacked him, as he was lying on the earth, and first lacerated his garments, but afterwards Tlepolemus himself, frequently biting him as he was rising from the ground. Nor did his good friend Thrasyllus repent of his nefarious undertaking, nor could he be satiated, though he perceived that satisfaction was made to his cruelty, by so great a danger. But while he, being astounded, covered his wounded legs, and miserably implored his assistance, Thrasyllus drove his lance through his right thigh, and this he did more confidently, because he thought that the wounds which he had made with his lance would resemble the scissures of teeth. Nevertheless, he easily also transfixed the beast. The young man being thus slain, all of us servants were called from our retreats, and ran sorrowing, obedient to his call. But he, though his wish was accomplished, and though he rejoiced in the death of his enemy, yet in his countenance he concealed his joy, assumed a severe aspect, and pretended to be grieved. Embracing also with avidity the body which he had made a corpse, he craftily dissembled all the offices of mourners, but tears alone were unwilling to be shed. Thus conforming himself to the similitude of us who truly lamented, he fraudulently attributed to the boar the crime of his own hand. Scarcely, however, had this wicked deed been transacted, when rumour divulged it, directed its first course to the house of Tlepolemus, and struck the ears of his unhappy wife. But she, indeed, as soon as she received this information, the like to which she had never heard, being deprived of reason, and stimulated by madness, hurried through the populous streets and solitary fields, and ran like one of the furious Bacchae, pitifully bewailing the fate of her husband. A sorrowful multitude of the citizens assemble on the occasion, and those that meet follow her, mingling their grief with hers. The whole city likewise is deserted, through the desire of seeing the melancholy event. And behold Charite runs to the dead body of her husband, and fainting, threw herself wholly upon it, so that she almost in that very place returned the life which she had devoted to him. But being with difficulty raised by the hands of her attendants, she unwillingly continued in existence. The remains of Tlepolemus, however, were brought to the funeral pyre, and all the people attending the mournful procession. In the meantime Thrasyllus began to vociferate excessively, and to beat his breast. And now, his joy increasing, he poured forth tears which he could not do in the beginning of his feigned sorrow, and falsified truth itself by the many appellations of friendship which he used. For he sorrowfully called him his friend, his equal, his companion, and lastly his brother, at the same time also adding his name. Sometimes, likewise, he prevented the hands of Charity from striking her breasts, endeavouring to appease her sorrow, to restrain her lamentations, to blunt the sharpness of her grief by alluring words, and to frame a web of solace from various examples of the instability of fortune. Nevertheless, he did not forget, amidst all his pretended offices of piety, his design of inveigling the woman, and nourished his own odious love by nefarious blandishments. As soon, however, as the funeral rites were finished, the woman immediately hastened to descend to her husband, and tried all possible ways of effecting her purpose. She certainly attempted that placid and tranquil method which requires no hostile weapons, but resembles gentle sleep. For at length, having concealed herself in profound darkness, she wasted away together with the light, through a miserable abstinence from food and squalid negligence. But Thrasyllus, through pertinacious importunity, partly by himself, and partly through the rest of her friends and necessary familiars, and also through the parents of Charity, persuaded her at length to refresh her members with the bath and with food, as they were now almost in a decayed condition from paleness and filth. She, however, who in other respects revered her parents, unwillingly indeed, but yielding to a religious necessity, performed, as she was ordered, the offices of the living, not indeed with a joyful, but with a little more serene countenance; her mind, at the same time, being profoundly distracted with sorrow and grief. She likewise consumed whole days and nights in sorrowful desire, and worshipping with divine honours, and with assiduous reverence, the image of her dead husband, which she had formed so as to resemble the god Bacchus, she tormented herself by that solace of her woe. But Thrasyllus, being precipitate and rash, before tears had satiated her grief, and the fury of her disturbed mind was mitigated, and before sorrow had vanished by the long duration of its vehemence, did not hesitate to speak to her about wedlock, while she was yet lamenting her husband, while she was yet lacerating her garments, and was yet tearing her hair, and thus impudently disclosed the silent secrets of his breast, and his ineffable stand. Charity, however, abhorred and detested his wicked suit, and she sunk down and lost all sense, as if she had been struck by violent thunder, and by the influence of some baneful star, or by the lightning of Jupiter. But after a certain interval of time, gradually recovering her spirits, she reiterated her wild clamours, and when she saw the scene which the most iniquitous Thrasyllus had prepared, she deferred the desire of the petitioner to the examination of counsel. Then, during the delay which this occasioned, the shade of the miserably slain Tlepolemus, lifting up his face defiled with gore and deformed by paleness, interrupted the chaste sleep of his wife by thus addressing her: "My dear wife, by which appellation it is not lawful for you to be called by any other person, if the memory of me still remains in your breast, or if the calamity of my bitter death dissolves the compact of our love, marry more felicitously some other person, only do not connect yourself with that sacrilegious Thrasyllus, nor speak to, nor recline at the same table, nor repose in the same bed with him. Avoid the bloody right hand of my murderer, and do not commence your nuptials from parricide. Those wounds, the blood of which these tears of yours have washed away, are not wholly the wounds inflicted by the teeth of the boar, but the lance of the wicked Thrasyllus has separated me from thee." He also added the rest, and disclosed the whole of the wicked scene. But she, as soon as, still sorrowing, she began to close her eyes in sleep, impressing her face on the bed, moistened her beautiful cheeks with flowing tears, even in her sleep, and being excited by this vision, as by some warlike machine, from her unquiet rest, she renewed her sorrow, and for a long time loudly lamented; and tearing her undergarment, she beat her graceful arms with her cruel hands. Nevertheless, not communicating to any one her nocturnal visions, but entirely dissembling the indication of the wicked deed, she determined with herself to punish the most iniquitous murderer, and silently withdraw herself from a miserable life. Again then, behold the detestable suitor of improvident pleasure was present, assailing ears that were closed to nuptial petitions. But she mildly rejecting the request of Thrasyllus, and dissembling her design with admirable cunning, replied as follows, to him urging and suppliantly requesting her consent. That beautiful face of your brother, that is, of him whom you call brother, and of my most dear husband, is yet familiarly present to my eyes, as yet the fragrant odour of his sweet body runs through my nostrils, as yet the beautiful Tlepolemus lives in my breast. You will do well, therefore, if you grant to a most miserable woman an interval of time necessary to legitimate grief, till the remaining space of the year is completed by the residual months. And this is a thing indeed which both regards my modesty and your salutary advantage, lest by acting otherwise we should happen to excite by immature nuptials the shade of my husband, rendered severe through a just indignation, to the destruction of your safety. Thrasyllus, however, not being recalled to prudence and moderation by this speech, nor being at least renovated by the seasonable promise, did not cease frequently to urge Charite with the base murmurs of his pestiferous tongue, till at length she, pretending that she was vanquished, said, However, my Thrasyllus, it is necessary that you should earnestly comply with this my request, that we may in the interim be secretly and silently connected with each other, and that no one of the domestics may perceive it till the expiration of the remaining days of the year. Thrasyllus yielded to the promise of the fallacious woman, most willingly consented to the proposal of a clandestine connection, and besides this ardently wished for the obscurity of night, making everything else a secondary consideration to the desire of enjoying Charite. But Charite said to him, Be careful that you come well disguised and without any attendants, and at the beginning of the night approach to my door, being satisfied with signifying by one whistle that you are there, waiting for my nurse, who shall watch for you at the bars of the gate, and having opened it, shall receive you, and bring you to my bedchamber, without the testimony of any light. The apparatus of the deadly nuptials pleased Thrasyllus, and not suspecting anything sinister, but being disturbed by expectation, he only complained of the extent of the day and the prolongation of the night. When, however, the sun had given place to night, Thrasyllus being disguised conformably to the mandate of Charite, and deceived by the fraudulent vigilance of the nurse, crept into the bedchamber with precipitate hope. Then the old woman, the nurse of Charite, receiving him with blandishment by the command of her mistress, secretly bringing forth cups and a vessel filled with wine mingled with a soporiferous poison, and pretending that the delay of her mistress was owing to her attendance on her father, who was ill, she easily buried him in sleep by the frequent cups of wine which she gave him, and which he fearlessly drank. And now he being in a condition in which he was exposed to all injuries, and lying supine, Charite being called, entered, and raging attacked him with a masculine mind and dire impetus, and stood over the homicide. Behold, said she, the faithful companion of my husband, behold the egregious hunter, behold my dear spouse. This is that right hand which shed my blood, this is the breast which contrived fraudulent stratagems to my destruction, these are the eyes which I have unfortunately pleased, which, nevertheless, now after a certain manner entering on future darkness, will antecede the impending punishment. Sleep securely, enjoy delightful dreams. I shall not attack you with a sword, nor with any other weapon. Far be it from me that I should wish to equal you with my husband by a similar kind of death. Your eyes shall die, you being alive, nor shall you seem to be anything except in sleep. I will take care to make you feel that the death of your enemy is more felicitous than your life. Certainly you shall not see the light, you shall be in want of the hand of a guide, you shall not embrace Charite, you shall not enjoy your expected nuptials, nor shall you be recreated with the repose of death, nor delighted with the pleasure of life, but you shall wander between the infernal regions and the sun, like some ambiguous image. You shall for a long time explore the hand which deprived you of sight, and what is the most miserable of all things in calamity, you shall be ignorant of whom you ought to complain. I will pour out the blood of your eyes as a sacrifice at the sepulchre of my Tlepolemus, and I will send those eyes as a funeral offering to his sacred shade. But why, by my delay, do you derive any gain from the punishment which you deserve? And perhaps you now imagine to yourself that you are enjoying my embraces, which will be to you pestiferous. Leaving, therefore, the darkness of sleep, awake to another penal obscurity. Lift up your face, deprived of eyes, recognize my revenge, understand your misfortune, and compute your miseries. It is thus that your eyes are pleasing to a chaste woman. It is thus that nuptial torches have illuminated your bedchamber. You'll have the Furies for your bridesmaids, and blindness, and the perpetual stimulus of an accusing conscience for your companions." Charity, having thus prophesied, and taken from her head a needle by which she separated her hairs, she pierced with it wholly the eyes of Thrasyllus, and leaving him entirely sightless, while, the cause of his pain being unknown, he shakes off ebriety together with sleep, she, seizing a drawn sword which Tlepolemus was accustomed to wear by his side, ran furiously through the middle of the city, and longing to accomplish I know not what wicked deed, directly went to the tomb of her husband. But we and all the people, abandoning our houses, anxiously pursued her, mutually exhorting each other to wrest the sword from her insane hands. Charity, however, standing near to the coven of Tlepolemus, and driving every one away with her glittering sword, when she beheld the abundant tears and various lamentations of all the crowd, said, "Cease this importunate weeping, and lay aside this grief, which is foreign to my fortitude. I have taken vengeance on the cruel destroyer of my husband. I have punished the deadly robber of my nuptials, and it is now time that, with this sword, I should seek the downward path to my Tlepolemus." And having narrated in order everything which her husband had told her in a dream, and by what craft she had attacked the deceived Thrasyllus, having buried the sword under her right breast, she fell down, and rolling herself in her own blood, and in the last place stammering words of an uncertain meaning, she breathed out her virile soul. Then immediately the friends of the miserable Charity, having washed her body, restored her to her husband, as a perpetual wife, by burying her with him in the same sepulchre. Thrasyllus, however, becoming acquainted with all these particulars, and not being able to repay a death adapted to the present tragical event, and also knowing that his sword was not sufficient to expiate so great a wickedness, was voluntarily brought to the same sepulchre; there, too, frequently exclaiming, "O ye shades, hostile to me, behold your spontaneous victim is present!" And having diligently closed the doors of the sepulchre upon himself, he determined by fasting to emit his spirit, now condemned by his own decision. The servant of Charity, profoundly sighing, and sometimes weeping, told all these particulars to the rustics, who were very much affected by his narration. Then they, fearing the novelty occasioned by changing their master, and more deeply lamenting the calamity of the house of their lord, prepared themselves for flight. But the keeper of the horses, to whose care I had been committed, with great commendation brought out of the cottage whatever was very valuable, and which he had kept concealed in it, and having laden me and the other labouring beasts with it, he left his pristine habitation. We carried little infants and women, we carried pullets, geese, kits, and whelps, and, in the last place, whatever retarded our flight, by its infirm step, that also walked with our feet, that is, was carried by us. Nor did the weight of the burden, though it was enormous, oppress me, because I left with a joyful flight that detestable amputator of my virility. When we had ascended to the arduous summit of a woody mountain, and had from thence descended into the plains beneath, the evening now darkening our path, we came to a certain populous and opulent castle, the inhabitants of which dissuaded us from our nocturnal, or even a morning egression from thence. For they told us that numerous wolves, large, burdened with a great mass of flesh, and raging with excessive ferocity, were accustomed to prowl about everywhere, and infest by the rapine the whole of that region. They added that they also now lay in wait in those very roads, and attacked like robbers those that passed through them, and moreover that, being rabid through insane hunger, they assaulted the neighbouring villages, and that, in consequence of this, the death which is alone adapted to the most inert cattle now impended over the heads of men; and lastly, that the half-eaten bodies of men lay in the very road through which we must pass, that every thing was white with bones denudated of their flesh, that on this account we also ought to proceed in that road with the greatest caution, and to observe especially that, in order to avoid the everywhere latent snares, we should pass through those dangerous places in a troop not dispersed into small parties, but compacted into one wedge, and this when it is perfectly light, when the day is advanced, and the sun is bright, and the impetus of dire beasts is repressed by the light. But those most iniquitous fugitives, our leaders, despising the salutary admonition, through the temerity of a blind fascination and the fear of an uncertain pursuit, without waiting for the approaching light of day, forced us laden on our journey, nearly about the third watch of the night, i.e., about midnight. Then I, not being ignorant of the before mentioned danger, was careful to defend my back from the attacks of those wild beasts, by proceeding, as much as I was able, in the middle of the troop, and concealing myself among the labouring beasts which surrounded me. And now all the rustics wondered at my surpassing in velocity the other horses. That swiftness, however, was not an indication of my alacrity, but of my fear. At length I thought myself that the celebrated Pegasus was more swift through fear, and on this account was deservedly said to be winged, while he leapt upward and rebounded as far as to the heavens, in consequence of dreading the bite of the ignivorous Chimera. For those shepherds who led us had armed their hands as if they were going to fight. This man bore a lance, that a hunting spear, another a dart, and another a staff. And they also carried stones, with which, from the rough road, they were largely supplied. Some likewise carried, in an elevated position, very sharp hedge-stakes, but most of them terrified the wild beasts by burning torches, and nothing but a trumpet was wanting to make our troop an army prepared for battle. Though, however, we in vain sustained that sufficiently empty fear, yet we fell into far worse dangers. For no wolves came against us, either, perhaps, through being terrified at the compact multitude of young men, or certainly by the excessive light of the torches, or because they went elsewhere in search of prey, and not even at a great distance from us were any wolves to be seen. But the rustics of the village, near which we happened to be then passing, thinking that our troop was a band of robbers, and being sufficiently attentive to their own concerns, and fearful in the extreme, excited against us with their usual clamours, and every kind of vociferation. Furious and large dogs, which were more cruel than any wolves and bears, and which they had very diligently nourished, with a view to their own safety. These dogs, besides their own genuine ferocity, being exasperated by the tumult of their masters, rushed against us, and pouring round us on all sides, leapt everywhere upon us, and, without making any distinction, lacerated at once both the labouring beasts and the men, and, after having for a long time assaulted us, they threw many of us to the ground. You might have seen a spectacle, not, by Hercules, so memorable as miserable, that is, a great number of dogs, some of which furiously seized on them that were flying, others attacked those that were standing still, and others leaped on those that were prostrate, and bit the whole of our troop as they passed through it. Behold, too, a greater evil followed our extreme danger. For those rustics suddenly rolled upon us stones from the tops of their houses, and from a neighbouring hill, so that we could by no means judge whether we should principally avoid the dogs, who attacked us near at hand, or the stones which were thrown at us from afar, one of which indeed suddenly struck the head of the woman who sat on my back, but she, being moved by the pain produced by the blow, immediately weeping and vociferating, implored the assistance of the shepherd, her husband. He, however, invoking the faith of the gods, and wiping away the blood of his wife, exclaimed in a louder voice, "Why do you so savagely attack and oppress us, miserable men and laborious travellers? Of what thefts are you afraid? What losses are you avenging? But you do not dwell in the caves of wild beasts, or in the rocks of barbarians, that you should rejoice in shedding human blood." Scarcely had he thus said, when immediately the thick shower of stones ceased, and the storm of the ferocious dogs was appeased on their being recalled. At length one of those rustics said, from the summit of a cypress tree, "We do not act in this manner as if we were robbers, through the desire of obtaining your spoils, but we repel from ourselves the slaughter which we fear from your hands. Now therefore you may depart secure and in tranquil peace." Thus he. We, however, proceeded on the rest of our journey, being wounded in various parts of our bodies, one with stones, another with the bites of dogs, and all of us were violently hurt. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8, Part 2 of The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 8, Part 2. After we had travelled to some distance, we arrived at a certain grove, planted with lofty trees, and delightfully pleasant, with open grass plats. Here our leaders thought fit to rest a little, and refresh themselves with food, and also diligently attend to the cure of their bodies, which were wounded in various parts. Reclining themselves, therefore, everywhere on the ground, they first began to restore their weary spirits, and afterwards they hastened to apply different remedies to their wounds. This man repressed his tumours with wet sponges, but another bound his gaping wounds with bandages, and after this manner each of them paid attention to his own welfare. In the meantime a certain old man was seen, from the top of a hill, whom the goats that were feeding about him evidently proclaimed to be a shepherd. Him one of our company asked, whether he had any milk to sell, either liquid or coagulated into new cheese. But he, shaking his head for a long time, said, "Do you now think of meat or drink, or in short, of any refreshment? Are you perfectly ignorant of the place into which you are come?" Having thus said, he turned away, and departed far from us, driving along his sheep. These words, however, and his flight, produced no small fear in our shepherds, and while they, being terrified, long to inquire into the nature of the place, and do not find any one who can give them this information, another old man, who was tall indeed, but oppressed with age, wholly leaning on a staff, and drawing along his wearied steps, approached us in our journey, weeping abundantly. On perceiving us, also, he embraced the knees of each of those young men, and thus addressed them, the tears copiously falling as he spoke. "I beseech you, by your fortunes and your genii, and so, by granting my request, may you arrive at the space of my old age, strong and joyful. Assist a debile old man, and restore to me, from the realms beneath, my little one, who is snatched from me at this advanced period of my life. For my nephew, and the sweet companion of this my journey, while accidentally endeavouring to catch a sparrow that was singing in a little hedge, fell into a ditch which was near him, and which was concealed by the shrubs that covered it, and his life is now in extreme danger. For I know by his weeping and by the voice of him often calling on the bird that he is still living, but I am unable to assist him, on account, as you may see, of the infirm condition of my body. To you, however, it will be easy, through the possession of youth and strength, to succour a most miserable old man, and to preserve for me that boy, my last successor and my only offspring." All that heard him, indeed, commiserated him, thus supplicating and tearing his hoary hairs. But one who was more courageous than the rest, and also younger and stronger in body, and who alone had escaped unhurt by the preceding battle, promptly arose, and inquiring in what place the boy fell, he without delay followed the old man, who pointed out to him with his finger a thicket of brambles, rough with thorns. And while we quadrupeds were refreshed by food, but the men by the attention they had paid to their wounds, every one taking his bundle, we resumed our journey. And, in the first place, they frequently and loudly called to the young man by his own proper name, but afterwards, being alarmed by his long stay, they sent one of their company to call him, who might search for and admonish him that it was time to depart, and might bring this their companion back with him. But he, having stayed for a short time, returned, and, trembling and pale, like the wood of the box-tree, related marvellous things of his associate. For he said, that he saw an enormous dragon lying upon and eating their companion who was prostrate, and which had now devoured the greatest part of his body, and that the miserable old man was not anywhere to be seen. On hearing this, and comparing it with the words of the shepherd, whom we had seen on the top of a hill, and who, doubtless, by his threats, admonished our people of that inhabitant of this region, and of no other, they fled most rapidly from that most noxious place, and drove us along, by frequently beating us with their staves. At length, having, with great celerity, finished a long journey, we came to a certain village, and there we rested through the whole of the night. And I am desirous of narrating an atrocious deed of a very memorable nature which I there heard. A certain servant, to whom his master had committed the whole protection of his family, and who was the bailiff of that most ample village at which we stopped, though he had a wife, who was a fellow servant with him, pertaining to the same master, yet burned with the desire of enjoying a certain woman who was free and a foreigner. Through which adulterous love his wife, being stimulated by jealousy, burnt all her husband's account books, and whatever was contained concealed in his storehouse. Nor was she content with having avenged the injury of her bed by this damage, but now, raging against her own bowels, she made a halter for herself, and bound with the same rope the little child which she had not long before brought forth from the same husband, and precipitated herself into a very deep well, drawing along with her the appendant infant. The master, however, of this woman and of her husband, being very much concerned for her death, seized the servant who had been the cause of his wife perpetrating so dire a deed, and firmly bound him, naked and wholly bedaubed with honey, to a fig tree, in the putrid stock of which a multitude of ants had settled, and poured themselves forth from the earth in different directions. These, as soon as they perceived the sweet and honeyed odour of his body, entirely adhered to it by small indeed, but numerous and continued bites, and so denudated his members by long torment, from their eating his flesh and viscera, and thus consuming the whole man, that at length his bones were left bare and exceedingly white, and still remained fixed to the deadly tree. Abandoning also this detestable mention, we again proceed on our journey, leaving the rustics in the greatest sorrow. And having travelled during the whole day, through level ground, we at length arrived, weary, at a certain populous and noble city. In this place those shepherds determined to dwell, and there to fix their perpetual habitation, because the city appeared to them to be a safe retreat from those who might search for them from a remote region, and they were also invited to settle there by the blessed abundance of provisions with which it was supplied. Lastly, having refreshed the bodies of us quadrupeds for 3 days, in order that we might appear to be more saleable, we were brought to the market, and the crier having proclaimed the price of each of us with a loud voice, the other horses and asses were bought by opulent merchants. But I, being the only one that remained, was passed over by most of the merchants with contempt. And now, through the weariness arising from being handled by those who computed my age from my teeth, I seized, with my teeth, and shattered the filthy hand of a certain person, who frequently rubbed my gums with his putrid fingers, which thing deterred the bystanders from buying me, as being most ferocious. Then the crier, when he had in vain spent his breath, and made himself hoarse in proclaiming me, began to compose ridiculous jests on my fortune. To what end, said he, do we in vain expose to sale this vile and old ass, debile with worn-out hoofs, deformed in colours, ferocious in his stupid sluggishness, and who is nothing else than a bolter, or sieve, to separate meal from bran, through the numerous and wide apertures of his hide? Wherefore let us give him to some one, if there is any one who will not be grieved to lose his hay. After this manner the crier excited the laughter of those by whom I was surrounded. But that most cruel fortune of mine, which, though I had fled through so many regions, I could not avoid nor appease by the evils which I had already endured, again turned upon me her blind eyes, and brought a buyer of me, found in a wonderful manner, and most adapted to my severe calamities. Hear therefore what sort of a person he was. An old catamite, bald indeed, but having long depending hair, curled and half grey, one of those vile dregs of the people who compel the Syrian goddess to beg, carrying her about through streets and towns, and playing on cymbals and crotala or rattles. This man, desiring exceedingly to buy me, asked the crier from what country I came. But he announced me to be a Cappadocian, and sufficiently strong. Again he asked what was my age. But the crier jesting, as if he had been speaking of a man, said, that a certain mathematician, that is, astrologer, who had made a scheme of his nativity, had declared him to be in his 5th year, but that he himself knew this better from his own profession. For though I know that I should incur the penalty of the Cornelian law if I should sell to you a Roman citizen for a slave, nevertheless what should hinder you from buying a good and profitable servant, who may assist you both abroad and at home? That odious buyer, however, did not cease to ask one question after another, and in the last place anxiously inquired about my mildness. But the crier to this replied, "You see not an ass, but a castrated ram, quietly disposed to all employments, not apt to bite or kick, but such a one as would induce you to think that a modest man dwelled in the hide of an ass, and this is a thing which it is not difficult to ascertain, for you may easily make trial of it by thrusting your face between his thighs, as you will then see how very patient he will show himself to be." In this ludicrous way the crier treated that helluo. But he, understanding the jest, said indignantly, "May the all-powerful and all-parent Syrian goddess, and may the holy Sabazius, that is Bacchus, Bellona, and the Idaean mother, Cybele, and also the sovereign Venus with her Adonis, cause you, O delirious crier, to be blind, and to become a deaf and dumb dead body, who, for some time past, have been employing against me scurrilous jests. Do you think, O stupid man, that I can commit a goddess to a ferocious ass, which, being disturbed, may suddenly throw off his back the divine image, and compel me, miserable man, to run with dishevelled hair, and search for some one who may raise my goddess from the ground, or repair the injury she may have sustained?" On hearing this, it suddenly occurred to me to leap as if I was furiously insane, in order that he, perceiving me exasperated by ferocity, might desist from buying me. But the buyer, who was anxious to possess me, prevented this my intention by immediately paying the sum of 17 denarii, which my master rejoicing readily received, though to my abhorrence, and directly delivered me, tied with a cord of bulrushes, to Philebus, for this was the name of my new master. And he, taking me as a new slave, brought me to his house, and immediately exclaimed from the very threshold of it, "Lo and behold, girls, I have bought for you a beautiful servant, and have led him hither." Those girls, however, were nothing more than a company of wanton dancers, who, immediately exulting for joy, raised dissonant clamours, with a broken, hoarse, and effeminate voice, thinking that some manservant had been in reality procured to wait on them. But when they saw it was not a stag that succeeded in the place of a virgin, but that an ass was substituted for a man, they, with turned-up nose, reviled their master in different ways, and told him that he had not brought a servant for them, but a husband for himself. They added, "Mind that you do not keep this little ass solely for your own enjoyment, but make us also sometimes a partaker of the object of your regard." Thus mutually babbling, they fastened me to the next manger. There was a certain young man, very corpulent and very skilful in playing on the flute, for contributions of money which were made by those that heard him, and who, abroad, preceded those that carried about the goddess, playing at the same time on his flute, but was a common catamite at home. This young man, as soon as he saw me in the house, willingly placed before me food in great abundance, and thus joyfully addressed me: "At length thou hast come as my substitute in the endurance of miserable labour, and may you live long, and please our masters, and prevent any further exertion of my debilitated powers." On hearing this, I revolved my future new miseries in my mind. But on the following day they went out, clothed with garments of various colours, each of them having a deformed appearance, their faces being bedaubed with dirty pigment, but their eyes elegantly painted, and having small mitres on their heads, and wearing saffron-coloured linen and silken vestments. Some of them also had white tunics, painted with purple, diffused through all the parts like small lances, and girded underneath with a zone, and their shoes were of a saffron colour. They likewise placed the goddess, covered with a silken veil, on my back, in order that I might carry her. and having their arms bare as far as to their shoulders, and holding up very large swords and axes, they proceeded leaping like those possessed with Bacchic fury, and exciting insane dancing by the sound of the pipe. And when they had passed by not a few small cottages, they came to a certain village, the owner of which was an opulent man, and at their first entrance, vociferating with dissonant clamours, they fanatically rush into it. Having their heads likewise for a long time in an inclined position, bending their necks, wantonly tossing their pendulous hair with a circular motion, and sometimes biting their muscles, they, in the last place, cut their arms with a two-edged sword which they carried. In the meantime, one of these was more largely seized with bacchanalian fury, and fetching frequent and profound sighs, as if he had been filled with the divine afflages of the goddess, he pretended that he was seized with insanity. Just as men are accustomed through the presence of the gods not to become better than they were before, so far as pertains to the body, but to be rendered debile or diseased. In the last place, consider what reward he received through divine providence. He began under false pretence to blame and accuse himself with a clamorous prediction, as if he had perpetrated something contrary to the laws of sacred religion, and besides this he also required that a just punishment for his wicked deed might be immediately inflicted on him by his own hands. Seizing therefore a whip which it is usual for those half men to carry with them, and which consists of twisted woollen fillets, hanging down in long fringes, and is chequered with many pastern bones of sheep, he gave himself with it many lashes which were severe on account of the numerous knots of the whip, being fortified with a wonderful firmness against the pain of the blows. You might perceive that the ground was moistened with the filthiness of the effeminate blood which flowed from the cuts of the swords and the lashes of the whips, which circumstance produced in me no small solicitude, on my perceiving the blood copiously streaming from so many wounds, lest the stomach of a foreign goddess should happen to desire asinine blood, just as the stomach of some men wishes to have asinine milk. When, however, being at length wearied, or at least satiated with the laceration of himself, he gave a respite to his torments, they received in their open bosoms brass and also silver coin, which many offered them, contending with each other who should give the most. Besides this, likewise they received from some a cask of wine, and milk, and cheese, and a quantity of wheat and barley. But others gave barley to me, the bearer of the goddess. After this they greedily collected everything, and enclosing what they had collected in sacks prepared for this species of gain, they placed it on my back, so that being oppressed with the weight of a twofold burden, I was at one and the same time a walking barn and temple. Wandering after this manner, they plundered all that region. But being exhilarated by the abundance of more than usual gain, they prepared a genial feast in a certain castle. For this purpose, through the fraud of a fictitious divination, they earnestly requested a very fat ram of a certain husbandman, in order that they might satisfy, by sacrificing it, the hunger of the Syrian goddess. And the supper being properly arranged, they betake themselves to the bath. And after they had washed themselves, they brought with them to the supper a certain very robust rustic, who was well prepared for their purpose by the strength of his sides, and having tasted of a very few small herbs, those most filthy catamites were excited before the table itself, to the extreme wickedness of illicit lust, and everywhere, spreading themselves round the naked and supine young man, they importune him with their execrable pruriency. My eyes, however, not being able any longer to endure such wickedness, I endeavoured to exclaim, O Quirites! But O alone proceeded from my lips, destitute of the other syllables and letters, clear indeed and strong, and adapted to the pronunciation of an ass, but perfectly inopportune as to time. For many young men from the next village, who had been inquiring for an ass that had been stolen from them by night, and who had explored all the stables with a vehement desire of finding it, on hearing me bray within the house, thinking the ass which they had lost was concealed in a secret part of that dwelling, burst into it unexpectedly with hasty steps, in order to seize openly their own property, and clearly detected them in the perpetration of their execrable filthiness. Now also immediately calling the neighbours together on all sides, they disclosed that most filthy scene, and besides this, they, in the way of ridicule, praised the most pure chastity of the priests. They, however, being very much troubled on account of the infamy, which easily spreading through the mouth of the people, would deservedly render them odious and execrable to all men, collected all their property, and secretly departed from the castle about midnight. Having also accomplished a good part of their journey before the rising of the sun, when it was now clear day, they came into impervious deserts, and having first conferred much with each other, they prepared themselves to put me to death. Taking the goddess, therefore, from my back, and placing her on the ground, they stripped me of all my harness, bound me to a certain oak, and lashing me with that whip, which was furnished with the pastern bones of sheep, after the manner of a chain, they almost brought me to extreme death. There was likewise one who threatened to cut the nerves of my hams with a cruel axe, because I had triumphed over his pure modesty, through revealing by my braying his execrable lust. But the rest thought that my life should be spared, in consequence of looking not to my safety, but to that of the image which was lying on the ground. Again, therefore, driving me along, laden with bundles, by striking me with the flat part of their swords, they came to a certain noble city. There a man of the first consequence, who was also religious and in a remarkable degree revered the gods, ran to meet us, being excited by the tinkling of the cymbals, the sound of the drums, and the sweet modulations of the Phrygian harmony. Receiving likewise the goddess in his hospitable dwelling which was devoted to religious purposes, he placed all of us within the enclosure of his most ample house, and endeavoured to propitiate the goddess by the greatest veneration and fat victims. Here too I remember I was especially in danger of losing my life. For a certain rustic sent as a gift to this religious man, who was his master, a very fat haunch of a large stag, which was a part of his hunting. This being carelessly suspended behind the kitchen door, at no very great height from the floor, a certain dog, which was also of the hunting kind, latently seized it, and rejoicing in his prey, rapidly fled from the view of those to whose care the haunch was committed. But the cook, when this loss was known, condemning his own negligence, and having for a long time lamented with inefficacious tears, and dreading the consequence, because his master would in a short time want his supper, closely embraced his infant son, and seizing a rope, attempted to hang himself. The extreme misfortune, however, of the husband was not concealed from his faithful wife, but violently seizing with both her hands the deadly rope, "Are you," said she, "so terrified by the present evil as to be out of your mind? And do you not perceive the fortuitous remedy which the providence of the gods administers to you? For if you are at all capable of reflecting in this extreme tempest of fortune, listen to me attentively. Lead that foreign ass into some remote place, there slay him, and cut off his thigh in the form of the haunch which you have lost, and set it before your master in the place of the stag, diligently cooked and highly seasoned with minced meat." The most iniquitous knave was pleased with the idea of saving his own life by my death, and having very much praised the sagacity of his wife, he also sharpened his knives, in order to effect my destined slaughter. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9, Part 1 of the Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 9, Part 1. After this manner, that most iniquitous executioner armed his impious hands against me. But I determined, in consequence of counsel being precipitated by the presence of so great a danger, without waiting the delay of long deliberation, to avoid by flight the impending slaughter of my body. And immediately bursting the cord by which I was tied, I hurried along with all the force of my feet, skirmishing by frequently employing my heels in defence of my safety. And rapidly running through the first porch, I violently entered, without delay, into a dining room, in which the master of the house was at supper, with the priests of the goddess, feasting on the flesh of the victims which he had immolated. And by thus rushing in, I broke and overturned many of the dishes, and also the tables, and other things of the like kind. by which foul destruction the master of the house being dismayed, he delivered me to a certain servant, and ordered him to keep me very diligently shut up, as importunate and wanton, in a place where I might not again disturb by a like petulance the tranquil banquet. There, being craftily defended by my sagacious counsel, and snatched from the midst of the hands of the executioner, I rejoiced in the custody of my salutary prison. But, indeed, it is not possible that anything prosperous can happen to one who is born a man without the concurrence of fortune. Nor can the fatal order of things, as established by divine providence, be subverted or renewed by any prudent counsel or sagacious remedy. Lastly, that crafty device itself, by which I seemed to have found a momentary safety, produced for me another great danger, or rather present death. For a certain menial lad, as I afterwards heard the domestics tell each other in a low voice, burst into the dining room with a countenance agitated by terror, and announced to his master that a mad dog had a little before run from the next street with a wonderful celerity through the back door, and had attacked the hunting dogs with a perfectly vehement fury, and afterwards had proceeded into the next stable, and rushed on the greater part of the labouring beasts in a similar rage, and in the last place, that he had not spared even the men themselves. For he said that Myrtilus the muleteer, Hephaestion the cook, Hypatius the chamberlain, Apollonius the physician, and many others of the family, while they endeavoured to avoid the dog, were all of them lacerated by it with various bites, and that some of the labouring beasts, which had been wounded by its venomous bites, were now seized with a similar fury. This narration immediately agitated the minds of all that heard it, and thinking that I also was affected with the same disease, they took up arms of every description and pursued me, exhorting each other to repel the common mischief, though at the same time they, rather than I, laboured under the same disease of raging madness. And without doubt they would have torn me in pieces with those lances, hunting spears, and axes, with which they were easily supplied by the servants, if I, considering the storm which was likely to burst upon me suddenly, had not immediately rushed into the bedchamber into which my masters had retired. Then, the doors being closed and locked upon me, they surrounded the place, till I, without any danger to their entrance, should be consumed, in consequence of being possessed and devoured by the pervicacious fury of that deadly pestilence. In this situation, having at length gained my liberty, and embracing the gift of solitude with which fortune had presented me, I threw myself on the bed which was there laid, and enjoyed human sleep, which for some time before I had not been able to obtain. And now, it being clear day, I rose in good health, liberated from lassitude, to the soft bed on which I had slept. Then I heard those who had passed a sleepless night in watching about my prison, thus disputing with each other concerning my destiny. Shall we believe that this miserable ass will be agitated with perpetual fury? But indeed, it is rather probable that the poison has become extinct, the rage being quiescent. Thus, difference of opinion led them at length to explore my condition. And looking through a certain fissure, they saw me standing at my ease in a sane and sober state. And now, having of their own accord opened the doors, they made trial whether I was become mild in a more ample manner. But one of them, who was sent from heaven to be my saviour, pointed out to the rest the following method of exploring my sanity, to wit, that they should offer me a vessel full of water, recently drawn, and that if I drank of it intrepidly, and after my accustomed manner, they might depend upon it that I was sane, and liberated from all disease, but that, on the contrary, if I avoided the sight and contact of the water, and was terrified at the view of it, it would be evident that the noxious fury still pertinaciously remained. For this, which is asserted in ancient books, is also verified by experience. This counsel being approved, they, still doubting the event, immediately offered me a large vessel full of transparent water drawn from a neighbouring fountain. But I, immediately proceeding to meet them, as I was very thirsty, drank, indeed, those truly salutary waters, inclining myself, and merging into the vessel the whole of my head. And now I placidly suffered them to pat me with their hands, to stroke my ears, and lead me by the halter, and to do whatever else they pleased in the way of making trial of my sanity, till, contrary to their insane presumption, I clearly proved my mildness to all of them. After this manner, having escaped twofold danger, on the following day I was again led forth to the journey, a circumforaneous mendicant, burdened with divine spoils, accompanied by cotilla and cymbals. And when we had passed by not a few little cottages and castles, we came to a certain village, built among the half-ruined vestiges of a city which was once opulent, as the inhabitants relate. Here, taking up our abode at the first inn that we found, we heard a pleasant narration about a poor man being cuckolded by his wife, which I also wish the reader to know. This man, labouring under great poverty, procured the means of subsistence by the small wages which he received from working as a carpenter. Nevertheless, he had a wife who was herself poor, but famous, or rather infamous, for extreme lasciviousness. But on a certain day, while he went in the morning to the work which he had undertaken to perform, an audacious adulterer immediately entered latently into his house. And while they fearlessly employ themselves in the colluctations of Venus, the husband unexpectedly returned home, ignorant of what was transacting, and at that time suspecting no such thing. And now, praising the continence of his wife because he perceived that the doors were shut and bolted, he knocked at the gate, announcing also by whistling that he was present. Then the crafty woman, who was most sagacious in the perpetration of crimes of this kind, having freed the man from her strict embraces, dissemblingly concealed him under a tub, which was half buried in the earth, in a corner of the house, but was nevertheless empty. And, having opened the street door, she received her husband as he was entering with severe language.
"And do you thus," said she, "come home to me, empty and idle, with your hands in your bosom, nor apply yourself to your accustomed work, in order that you may provide for our subsistence, and procure for us something to eat? But I, unhappy woman, exercise my fingers by night and by day in spinning wool, that at least a lamp may shine within our little abode. How much more happy than I am is our neighbour Daphne, who, filling herself early in the morning with wine and meat, wallows with her adulterers."
The husband, being thus reproved, said, "What do you mean? For though the master of our workshop, being attentive to his forensic employment, has given us a holiday, nevertheless I have provided for our supper tonight. Do you see that tub, which, being superfluous, in vain occupies so much space, and in reality affords nothing further than an impediment to our habitation? This I have sold for 5 pence to a certain person who is here present, that, having paid the price of it, he may take it as his own property with him. Make yourself ready, therefore, and lend me a hand for a little while, that, having scraped it clean, it may be immediately delivered to the buyer." The fallacious woman, immediately bursting into an audacious laugh, said, "The husband which I have married is certainly a great man, and a strenuous negotiator, who, while I, who am only a woman and confined at home, have already sold a thing for 7 pence, has sold it for a less sum." The husband, being joyful at the addition to the price of the tub, said, "Who is he? Who has bought it at so great a price?" To which he replied, "He has long ago, stupid man, descended into the tub, in order that he might diligently explore its solidity." Nor was the adulterer deficient in confirming what the woman said, but, promptly rising from the tub, said, "Do you wish, mistress, to know the truth? This tub of yours is too old, and injured in many places by gaping fissures." And turning himself dissemblingly to her husband, "But do you," said he, "my friend, whoever you are, bring me immediately a lamp, that, having scraped off the filth which is in the inside of the tub, I may be able to know accurately whether it is fit for use, unless you think that we obtain money in an improper manner." The sagacious and egregious husband, without any delay, and not suspecting anything, having lit a lamp, said, "Depart, brother, and keep yourself quiet, till I shall have brought this tub into a fit condition for you to receive." And having thus said, he stripped himself, and taking the lamp with him, began to scrape off the indurated feces which adhered to the rotten tub. She, however, putting her head into the tub, deluded her husband with meretricious craft. She pointed out with her finger this place and that, and another, and again another, which required to be purified, till, both works being accomplished, the miserable carpenter was compelled, having received 7 pence, to carry the tub on his back to the house of the adulterer. Those most pious priests, having remained there for a few days, and been fattened by the public munificence, and laden with many rewards of their divination, devised for themselves a new kind of gain. Having fabricated one oracle, adapted to many cases, they deluded many who consulted them about various particulars. But the oracle was as follows: Together yoked the oxen, till the ground, that stocks abundant, may from thence arise. Then, if any who wished to engage in matrimony from the admonition of the oracle consulted them, they said, it answered the very thing which they wished to know, to wit, that they should be conjoined in wedlock, in order that they might produce stocks of children. If any one who was about to buy land interrogated them, they said that the oracle very properly spoke of oxen, as also of the yoke, and of fields flourishing with crops of corn. If someone, being solicitous about traveling, consulted the divine oracle, they said that the mildest of all quadrupeds were to be now yoked together and prepared for the journey, and that gain was promised them through the germ of the glebe. And if someone who intended to engage in battle or to pursue a band of robbers asked them whether the event of his undertaking would be prosperous or not, they asserted that victory was promised by the predication of the oracle, which signified that the necks of the enemies should be brought under the yoke, and a most abundant and fruitful spoil be obtained by rapine. And after this manner, by the fraudulent craft of divination, they collected no inconsiderable sum of money. Being, however, at length exhausted by perpetual interrogations, and by always giving the same answer, they again began to travel through a road much worse than that which we had passed through during the night. For it was interrupted by profound ditches and whirlpools, which were partly filled with stagnant water, and in other places was slippery with miry filth. Lastly, I was scarcely able to arrive at length, much fatigued, at level paths, my legs being bruised by continual falls. And behold, on a sudden, a troop of armed horsemen came upon us from behind, and having with difficulty restrained the impetus of the running horses, they eagerly flew upon Philebus and the rest of his associates, and tying them by the neck, and calling them sacrilegious and impure, they sometimes struck them with their fists, bound them fast with manacles, and urged them to produce quickly the golden bowl, and thus bring forth that pledge of their crime, which they had privately stolen from the bed of the Mother of the Gods, under the pretext of solemn rites, which they should secretly perform, and afterwards silently departed, at the dawn of day, beyond the boundaries of the city, as if they could escape the punishment of so great a crime. Nor was there wanting one who, putting his hand on my back, and searching in the very bosom of the goddess, whom I carried, found the golden bowl, and drew it out, in the sight of all that were present. But those most impure men could not either be convinced or terrified by the disclosure of a deed which was at least so nefarious, but, jesting, accompanied with a fictitious laugh, they said, Behold the unluckiness of an unworthy circumstance. How many innocent men are in danger on account of one bowl only, which the Mother of the Gods presented as a hospitable gift to her sister, the Syrian goddess? They having stupidly uttered these and other trifles of the same kind, the rustics led them back, and immediately bound and cast them into prison. And the bowl and the image of the goddess, which I carried, being restored and consecrated in that part of the temple where gifts were deposited, on the following day they brought me forth, and again, by the voice of the crier, exposed me to be sold. But a certain baker from the next little town bought me for 7 pieces of money more than Philebus had before given for me. And he, having immediately laden me with corn which he had bought, led me through a road, difficult, from the little sharp stones with which it abounded, and encumbered with roots of every kind, to the mill where he ground his corn. There many labouring beasts turned mills in their different circuits by proceeding through various gyrations. Nor was it by day alone, but also, being vigilant through the whole of the night, they made flour by the light of a lamp, and the continual rotation of the mills. But my new master afforded me the best accommodation, lest I should be terrified at the rudiments of my servitude. For he gave me a holiday the first day, and abundantly furnished my manger with food. That beatitude, however, of leisure and exuberant food did not endure any longer than a day. But on the following morning I was bound to that mill which appeared to be the largest, and immediately, my eyes being covered, to prevent my being giddy from the gyrations, I was impelled into the curved spaces of a circular path, excavated like a canal, so that I might wander with a sure winding in the orb of a circumfluent boundary, with a reciprocal pace, treading my footsteps over again. Nevertheless, not entirely forgetting my sagacity and prudence, I did not show myself an apt tyro of this discipline. But, though I had frequently seen machines similarly circumvolved when I lived among men, nevertheless I stood still, feigning that I was seized with a stupor, as one ignorant of and unskilled in that kind of work. For I thought indeed that I should be employed in some other easier work, as being but little adapted and sufficiently useless for labour of that kind, or at least that I should be fed in idleness. I exercised, however, in vain a pernicious sagacity, for many, furnished with staves, immediately surrounded me, and as I was even then without fear, in consequence of my eyes being covered, on a sudden a signal was given, and with repeated clamours they heaped blows upon me, and so disturbed me with the noise, that, laying aside all my crafty designs, I immediately ran briskly, and strenuously thrust forward with my breast, and with great sagacity, the rope by which, through my circuitous course, the mill was turned. By this sudden change of counsel, I excited the laughter of all the company, and now, the greatest part of the day passed over, they liberated me, that was otherwise much fatigued, from the machine, taking off the rope by which I was tied to the mill, and led me to the manger. But I, though excessively fatigued, and very much in want of renovation of strength, and almost perishing with hunger, nevertheless, being impelled by my usual curiosity, and sufficiently anxious, I observed with a certain delight the discipline of that disagreeable workshop, neglecting the food which was placed before me in great abundance. Good gods, what abject fellows were the men that were there! The whole of their skin was marked with livid spots, and their scarred backs were rather shaded than covered with torn garments composed of shreds. Some had only their private parts concealed by a small covering, and all of them were so clothed that their skin might be seen through the intervals of the patches. Their foreheads were marked with letters, their hair was half shaved off, and their feet were bound with fetters. They were also deformed through paleness, and their eyelids were corroded with the smoky darkness of black vapour, and on this account they had bad eyes. They were likewise filthily white through the flour of the meal, like those pugilists who fight sprinkled with fine dust. But what and after what manner shall I speak of the labouring beasts, my associates? What of those old mules and infirm horses? With their heads inclined downward about the manger, they diminished the heaps of chaff. Their necks were putrid with wounds. Their nostrils, which laboured in breathing, were languid and wide through the continual pulsation of coughing. Their breasts were ulcerated through the constant friction of the ropes by which they were tied. Their sides were bared even to their bones by perpetual castigation. Their hoofs were extended to an enormous size by manifold circumduction, and the whole of their hide was rough with inveterate and scabby leanness. Fearing that the same baneful misery with which this family was affected would happen to me, recollecting also the fortune of the pristine Lucius, and perceiving myself thrust down to the last goal of safety, I lamented my condition with a dependent head. Nor was any solace of a painful life anywhere present, except that I was recreated through my innate curiosity, while, making no account of my presence, all of them freely said and did before me whatever they pleased. Nor was it without reason that the divine author of ancient poetry among the Greeks, desiring to exhibit a man of consummate prudence, sings of Ulysses in the Odyssey, that he acquired the greatest virtue through wandering over many cities and through the knowledge of different nations. For I confess that I owe great thanks to my asinine form, because, concealing me by its covering, and exercising me through various fortunes, it certainly rendered me, if not more wise, yet knowing in many things. Lastly, I have determined to narrate to you an excellent tale, which I have found to be delightful in the extreme, and behold, I begin as follows. The baker, who had made me his own for a sum of money, and who was otherwise a good man and very moderate, sustained the greatest punishment in the marriage bed, and his family, in consequence of being allotted a wife who was the worst and most wicked of women, so that, by Hercules, I also frequently lamented his condition in silence. For there was no vice that was not present with that most iniquitous woman, but there was entirely a conflux of all crimes in her mind, as in some miry privy. She was inauspicious, cruel, addicted to men and to wine, pervicacious and pertinacious, greedy in base rapine, profuse in filthy expenditure, inimical to fidelity, and hostile to chastity. Then, despising and trampling on the divine powers instead of the true religion, counterfeiting a nefarious opinion of God, whom she asserted to be the only deity, to the exclusion of other gods who proceed from and are rooted in the first God, devising also vain observances, and deceiving all men, and likewise her miserable husband, she enslaved her body to morning draughts of pure wine, and to continual adultery. This woman, being thus ill-disposed, persecuted me with a wonderful hatred. For, while she was yet lying in bed before the break of day, she commanded with a loud voice that the ass which had been recently purchased should be tied to the mill. And as soon as she had left her bedchamber, she ordered that many blows should be given to me in her presence, she herself standing by those who beat me. When also the other labouring beasts were liberated from their toil at dinner time, I was led to the manger through her mandate much later than the rest, by which cruelty she greatly increased my native curiosity in observing her manners. For I perceived a certain young man very frequently going into her bedchamber, whose face also I very much desired to behold, if the covering of my head would have afforded that liberty to my eyes. For I was not in want of sagacity sufficient to detect in some way or other the crimes of a most iniquitous woman. A certain old woman, however, who was a medium and a messenger between her and her adulterer, was daily present with her as an inseparable companion, with whom, first breakfasting and afterwards contending with her in drinking alternately pure wine, she devised insidious machinations by fraudulently circuitous means to the destruction of her miserable husband. But I, though I was very much enraged at the error of Photis, who had made me an ass, while she wished to change me into a bird, nevertheless I was gratified in having this one solace of my lamentable deformity, that being furnished with very long ears, I easily heard everything, even though at a great distance. At length, on a certain day, the following words of that timid old woman came to my ears: "My mistress, consider with yourself what you mean to do with that sluggish and false-hearted friend, with whom you became familiar without my advice, and who in a cowardly manner dreads the severe countenance of your unpleasant and odious husband, and through this slothfulness of his languid love torments you by deferring your willing embraces. How much superior to him is Felicitaris, a young man beautiful, liberal, and strenuous, and most steadfast in eluding the inefficacious vigilance of husbands. By Hercules, he alone is worthy to enjoy the embraces of all mistresses of families. He alone deserves to wear a golden crown on his head, on account of this one thing which he lately devised with wonderful cunning against a certain married man who was jealous. Hear, therefore, and compare together the different disposition of both these lovers. You know a certain person of the name of Barbarus, a senator of our city, whom the vulgar call Scorpion, on account of the asperity of his manners? This man very cautiously kept close in his house a noble wife of surpassing beauty, defending her with a wonderful guard. To this, that abandoned wife of the baker, replying, said, Why should I not? I know her very well. You speak of Arete, my schoolfellow. You know, therefore, said the old woman, the whole history of Felicitaris. By no means, replied the baker's wife, but I very much desire to know it, and beseech you, mother, to narrate every particular to me in order. And without delay, that old woman, who was an excessive talker, thus began. That Barbarus, when he was about to undertake a necessary journey, and was desirous most carefully of preserving the chastity of his beloved wife, secretly admonished his servant Myrmex, whom he knew to be in the highest degree faithful to him, and committed to his fidelity the entire custody of his mistress, at the same time threatening him with imprisonment, perpetual bonds, and lastly a violent death and famine, if any man, even in passing by, did but touch her with his finger. And this he confirmed through swearing by all the divine powers. Leaving, therefore, Myrmex, who was struck with the greatest terror, as a most vigilant and inseparable attendant on his wife, he commenced his journey without any solicitude. Then Myrmex, with a mind firmly resolved and vehemently anxious, would not suffer his mistress to go anywhere, and keeping her at home occupied in spinning wool, was constantly with her, only suffering her, as a thing that was necessary, to go to the bath in the evening, and then adhering and, as it were, agglutinated to her, and holding with his hand the fringe of her garment, he faithfully performed the office committed to him with wonderful sagacity. But the beauty of this noble matron could not be concealed from the ardent vigilance of Felicitaris, and being captivated and inflamed by this celebrated chastity and extreme vigilance of her remarkable tutelage, he prepared himself with all his might to vanquish the tenacious discipline of that house. Being also certain of the fragility of human fidelity, and that all difficulties are pervious to money, and that it is usual for even adamantine doors to be broke open by gold, having opportunely found Myrmex alone, he unfolded to him his love, and suppliantly implored him to administer a remedy to his torment. For he said that he had determined and decreed to die in a short time if he did not very soon obtain the object of his wish. He also farther observed to Myrmex that he ought not to fear anything in an affair which might be easily accomplished, since he could penetrate into the house in the evening unattended by anyone, covered and concealed by the fidelity of darkness, and in a moment of time after leave it. To these and similar persuasions he added a powerful wedge, for the purpose of cleaving the perfectly rigid tenacity of a servant. For opening his hand, he showed him glittering pieces of solid gold, which was to Myrmex a spectacle entirely new, 20 of which, he said, he had destined to the woman, but that he willingly offered to him 10. Myrmex was horribly terrified at the mention of a wickedness which he had never heard of before, and immediately fled with closed ears. Nevertheless, the flaming splendor of the gold could not depart from his eyes, but though he was far removed from Felicitaris, and had arrived with rapid steps at home, yet he seemed to himself still to behold those beautiful splendors of the money, and already possessed in his mind an opulent spoil. The miserable man also was plucked and torn asunder into different opinions, with a wonderful fluctuation of mind. Their fidelity here gain urged him, their torment dissuaded, here pleasure invited. Nevertheless, at last, gold vanquished the fear of death. Nor could his desire of the beautiful money be at least mitigated by time. But pestilent avarice invaded him also with solicitude by night, so that the threats of his master retained him at home, yet gold called him abroad. Then, having devoured shame and removed delay, he immediately conveyed to the ears of his mistress the message of Felicitaris. Nor did the woman revolt from her genuine levity, but immediately sold her modesty for execrable metal. Thus Myrmex, overflowing with joy at the precipice of his fidelity, and wishing not only to receive but also to handle the money which he had seen to his destruction, gladly told Philisiterus that he had at length with great labour accomplished what he desired, and immediately demanded the promised reward. And thus the hands of Myrmex now held golden, which had never before touched even copper, money. And now, the night being advanced, he brought that strenuous lover, unattended by any one, to the house, and introduced him, with his head well covered, so as to conceal his face, into the bedchamber of his mistress. Scarcely, however, had they sacrificed to recent love with new embraces, scarcely had the new and naked soldiers received the first stipends in the warfare of Venus, when the husband, availing himself of the opportunity afforded by night, was suddenly present, contrary to the expectation of every one. And now he knocks at the gate of his own house. Now he calls and strikes the door with a stone, and, becoming more and more suspicious by the delay, he threatens to inflict dire punishments on Myrmex. But he, being greatly agitated by the sudden evil, and brought to a want of counsel through his miserable trepidation, said, as the only thing which he could say, that the darkness of the night prevented him from finding the key which he had carefully concealed. In the meantime, Philisiterus, on hearing the clamour, having hastily put on his garment, but his feet, through trepidation being uncovered, ran out of the bedchamber. Then Myrmex, having at length put the key into the lock, opened the gate, and received his master, loudly calling on the faith of the gods. And while he hastily goes into the bedchamber, Myrmex let out Philisiterus, who hurried away with a clandestine flight. But Myrmex, as soon as Philisiterus had left the house, considering himself as now secure, after he had fastened the door, again composed himself to sleep. Barbarus, however, on going out of the bedchamber at break of day, saw under the bed shoes, unknown to him, which Philisiterus had on when he entered into the chamber. And, suspecting from this circumstance what had been transacted, but not divulging either to his wife or any of his domestics the grief which he endured, he took the shoes and privately concealed them in his bosom, and, only ordering that Myrmex should be led bound by his fellow servants towards the forum, he rapidly went thither himself, silently groaning, conceiving that he should certainly find who was the adulterer by the indication of the shoes. But behold, while Barbarus proceeded through the street, enraged, with a turgid face and contracted eyebrows, and Myrmex behind him oppressed with chains, not indeed detected in a manifest crime, but convicted by his own most evil conscience, and exciting inefficacious pity by his abundant tears and extreme lamentations, while this took place, Philisiterus, opportunely passing that way, though he was previously engaged in business of a different kind, yet being moved, though not terrified, by the sudden spectacle, and recollecting the fault occasioned by his haste, he suspected what was likely to follow. Immediately, therefore, having sagaciously assumed his usual audacity, and dispersing the servants, who led Myrmex along in chains, he rushed on Myrmex with extreme clamour, and gently striking him with his fist on the face, "May this your master," said he, "and all the celestial gods whom you have invoked by rashly swearing, destroy you as you deserve, O most iniquitous and perjured man, who yesterday stole my shoes from the bath. You deserve, by Hercules, you deserve to wear out those chains, and besides this, also to endure the darkness of a prison." Barbarus, being deceived, or rather mocked, by this opportune fallacy of the vigorous young man, and unsuspectingly believing in what he said, again returned home, and, having called Myrmex and showed him the shoes, voluntarily pardoned him, and persuaded him to restore the shoes to the master from whom he had stolen. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Recording by Thomas Copeland. Chapter 9, Part 2 of The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 9, Part 2. Scarcely had the old woman finished her tale, when the baker's wife thus resumed her discourse. "Oh, how blessed is that woman who enjoys the liberty of associating with so firm a friend! But I, miserable creature, have met with a lover who is even frightened at the noise of the mill, and the concealed face of that scabby ass." To this the old woman replied, "I will even now cause that lover of yours to be with you promptly at the appointed time, well persuaded and resolute." And having likewise promised that she should return in the evening, she departed from the bedchamber. But that chaste wife immediately prepared a princely banquet. She defecates by percolation the precious wine, tempers the new-made pottage with seasoning, and furnishes the table with abundance of food. In short, the coming of the adulterer is expected like the advent or manifestation of some god. For opportunely the husband supped abroad at the house of a neighbouring fuller. Midday, therefore, approaching, I being at length freed from my harness and permitted to refresh myself in quiet, I did not, by Hercules, so much rejoice in my liberation from labour, as that, my eyes being uncovered, I should now be able to behold without restraint all the arts of the wicked woman. The sun, indeed, having now descended under the ocean, had illuminated the inferior parts of the earth, when, behold, the rash adulterer came, closely following the iniquitous old woman, he himself being very young, and still conspicuous by the polished smoothness of his chin, still being himself the delight of adulterers. The woman, having received him with many kisses, desired him to recline himself for the supper she had prepared. But no sooner had the young man touched with the extremity of his lips the cup which was drunk out of previous to eating, and just begun to taste the food, than the husband came, returning much sooner than they expected. Then the egregious wife, having earnestly prayed for dire curses upon him, and wishing that he might break his legs, hid the adulterer, trembling with pale fear, under the wooden bin, which then happened to lie near her, in which a confused heap of corn was usually purified. And by her innate craft, dissembling a deed so wicked, and assuming an intrepid countenance, she inquired of her husband why he came home so prematurely, relinquishing the supper of his most intimate companion. But he, with a mind perfectly afflicted, and continually sighing, said, "Not being able to bear the detestable and extreme wickedness of an abandoned woman, I took myself to flight. Good gods, what a wife! How faithful and how temperate! And yet she defiled herself with a most filthy crime. I swear by this holy Ceres that I can even now scarcely believe the testimony of my eyes concerning such a woman." The most audacious wife of the baker, being incited by these words of her husband, and desiring to know the affair, did not cease to importune him to narrate the whole transaction from the beginning. Nor did she desist till her husband complied with her wish. And thus, being ignorant of the misfortune of his own house, he related that of the family of another. "The wife of my associate, the fuller, who seemed to be a woman of undefiled chastity, and who, being always renowned for her modesty, chastely ruled the house of her husband, was inflamed with a secret love for a certain adulterer. And as she continually indulged in furtive embraces with that young man, she was in the act of being connected with him at the very moment of time in which we, having bathed, went to supper. Being therefore disturbed by our sudden presence, she hid him in a wicker coop, which being plaited from willow twigs into an erect heap, and smoked with the white fume of sulphur, was used for the purpose of whitening the cloth that was placed round it. And he being now safely concealed, as it seemed to her, she fearlessly participated with us of the table. In the meantime, the young man, being oppressed and obscured by the odour of the sulphur, became faint through the interception of his breath, and that living mineral caused him to sneeze frequently, as it is natural for it to do. But as soon as the husband, who sat opposite to his wife, heard the sound of sneezing behind his back, because he thought it proceeded from his wife, he wished her well in the usual words, and this he did when he again heard the sneezing, and also when it was frequently repeated, till, being moved by the excessive repetition of it, he at length suspected what the thing was. Immediately, therefore, pushing away the table at which she sat, and removing the coop, he drew forth a man, who was with great pain restoring his frequent emissions of breath. And being inflamed with indignation on account of the disgraceful circumstance, calling for a sword, he longed to kill a man who would have expired in a short time, unless I, considering our common danger, had, though with difficulty, prevented him from his furious attack by assuring him that his enemy would shortly die through the powerful odour of the sulphur, without any blame being attached to us. And he, being rendered more mild, not by my persuasion, but by the necessity of the thing itself, brought him, who was now but half alive, into the next street. Then I secretly admonished, and at length prevailed on his wife, to withdraw herself for a short time from the shop, and betake herself to a certain woman with whom she was familiar, till the enraged mind of her husband should be appeased, who, I did not doubt, was so exasperated and so agitated with fury, that he would certainly perpetrate something more deadly, both on himself and his wife. And thus, being wearied with the supper of my associate, I returned to my own house. While the baker narrated these particulars, that shameless and audacious woman had, long before the tale was finished, expressed by execrations how much she detested the wife of the fuller, calling her perfidious, unchaste, and lastly, the great disgrace of all her sex, who, laying aside her own modesty and trampling on the league of the marriage bed, had defiled with meretricious infamy the house of her husband, and now had procured for herself the name of a prostitute, having lost the dignity of a married woman. She added that such females ought to be burnt alive. Nevertheless, through the joint admonition of her silent wound, and her own filthy conscience, in order that she might sooner liberate her adulterer from the torment of his covering, she frequently urged her husband to go to bed as soon as possible. He, however, mildly requested that the table might be placed for him, as, his supper being intercepted at the house of the fuller, he had fled from thence perfectly hungry. Then the wife hastily set the table before him, though unwillingly, because it was designed for another person. But my bowels were perfectly lacerated when I reflected on the preceding wickedness, and the present audacity of this most abandoned woman, and I sedulously deliberated with myself whether I could by any means give assistance to my master by detecting and revealing the fraud of his wife, and by throwing off the covering, expose to the view of every one him who was concealed like a tortoise under the bin. At length divine providence regarded me, thus tormented with the disgrace of my master, for the lame old man, to whose care our custody was committed, led all us labouring beasts, collected into one body, to the next lake, for the sake of drinking, the time now requiring that this should be done. And this circumstance administered to me a most opportune occasion of revenge, for, in passing by, I observed the extremities of the fingers of the adulterer, which were protuberant through the narrow openings of the hollow covering, and pressing these with my inflected and sharp hoof, I bruised them so as to reduce them to the greatest tenuity, till, being excited by the intolerable pain, he sent forth a sorrowful clamour, and pushing away and throwing down the bin, he unfolded, to the sight of all that were present, the scenic apparatus of the lecherous woman. Nevertheless, the baker, not being greatly disturbed by the loss of his wife's modesty, thus began to soothe, with a serene front and conciliated face, the young man, who was trembling with exsanguous paleness. "You need not fear, my son, that anything of a sorrowful nature will be inflicted on you by me. I am not a barbarian, nor endued with a rustic deformity of manners, nor will I kill you with the deadly fume of sulphur, after the example of the truculent fuller. Nor indeed will I bring such an elegant and beautiful youth in danger of losing his life, through the severity of the law concerning adultery. But I will divide with my wife my pleasure with you, and she shall be common both to you and me. For I have always lived with my wife in such concord, that, according to the dogma of the philosophers, the same things are pleasing to both of us. But neither does equity suffer the wife to have more authority than the husband. With such like flattering language, having derided the young man, he led him reluctant to a bed, and sending away his most chaste wife, who followed him to another bed, he, lying alone with the youth, enjoyed the most grateful avengement of corrupted nuptials. But as soon as the lucid chariot of the sun had made the day, the baker, having called 2 of his most robust servants, and striking with a ferule the buttocks of the youth, who was lifted to a considerable height for the purpose, said to him, "Do you, who are so soft and tender, and but a boy, defrauding lovers, wantonly desire women in the flower of your age, and commit adultery with such as are free, and connected by the conjugal compact, and vindicate to yourself the unseasonable name of an adulterer?" Having reproached him in these and many other words, and besides this punished him abundantly with blows, he turned him out of doors. He, however, being the bravest of all adulterers, having obtained unhoped for safety, though his fair posteriors had been burst by night, and for a long time, sorrowfully fled. Nevertheless, the baker divorced his wife, and immediately thrust her out of her own house. But she, besides her genuine wickedness, being profoundly excited and exasperated by the contumelious language of her husband, though it was just, returned to her treasury of fraud and the accustomed arts of females, and with great care searched for a certain crafty woman, who was believed to be capable of effecting anything by incantations and sorcery, besought her with many prayers, and burdened her with many gifts, requesting of her one of 2 things, to wit, that she would either again cause her to be reconciled to her husband by appeasing him, or, if that could not be accomplished, that she would send some ghost or some dire demoniacal power to take away his life by violent means. Then that sorceress, and who was capable of effecting divine works, employed at first only the milder instruments of her wicked art, and endeavoured to bend the mind of the husband that had been vehemently offended, and impel it to love. But when the event of the thing was different from what she expected, being indignant with the gods, and besides the loss of the gain which she would have obtained if she had succeeded, being also stimulated by the contempt which she had sustained from the divine powers, she now began to attack the life of the most miserable husband, and to stimulate to his destruction the ghost of a certain woman who had suffered a violent death. Perhaps, however, O scrupulous reader, you, reprehending my narration, will argue as follows: "But whence, O foolish ass, could you know what was done by women in secret, as you say you did, when, at the same time, you were confined within the boundaries of a bakehouse? Hear, therefore, how a curious man, sustaining the form of an ass, knew all that was transacted with a view to the destruction of my master, the baker. Nearly about midday, a woman suddenly appeared in the bakehouse, deformed with severe sorrow, as if she was guilty of some crime, half clothed with a coarse mantle, having her feet naked and without shoes. And being thus ill-favoured through leanness, there was in her face a paleness like that of box. Her hair likewise was half grey, torn, and filthy through the interspersion of ashes, and, hanging over her forehead, concealed the greatest part of her face. This woman, thus deformed in her attire, gently with her hand taking hold of the baker, led him into his bedchamber, as if she had something to say to him in secret, and having shut the door, she stayed there a long time. But when all the corn was ground which had been given to the servants of the baker, and it became necessary to ask for more, the lesser men servants, standing near the bedchamber, called their master by name, and asked for more corn to supply the mill. And as no master answered them, though they frequently called him, and with a loud voice, they now more forcibly knocked at the door. Because likewise it had been most carefully bolted, suspecting something of greater consequence, and of a worse nature than usual, with great effort they at length either plucked off or broke the hinges, and made an entrance for themselves. That woman, however, was nowhere to be found, but they saw their master hanging from a certain beam to which he was tied, and now lifeless. Freeing him, therefore, from the knot by which his neck was fastened, they took him down from the beam with the greatest lamentations and weeping, and procured for his corpse the last ablution. Having likewise performed the offices pertaining to the dead, they buried him, a great crowd attending the funeral. On the following day his daughter came running from the next little town in which she had lately been married, sorrowful, shaking her pendulous hairs, and sometimes beating her breasts with her hands, for she knew all that happened, though no one had narrated to her the misfortune of the house, because the lamentable form of her father had presented itself to her in sleep, having the neck still tied with a cord, and unfolded to her all the wickedness of her stepmother, the adultery, the enchantment, and how he had descended to the realms beneath, being strangled by a nocturnal ghost. And when she had tormented herself by long-continued lamentation, at length, being restrained by the concourse of her friends and acquaintance, she gave a pause to her grief. And now, the funeral solemnities being in the usual manner completed as his sepulchre, on the 9th day she brought forth the servants, the furniture, and all the labouring beasts to be sold by auction. Then the rash fortune of an uncertain sale dispersed in various ways the property of one house. Lastly, a certain poor gardener bought me for 50 pieces of money, which he said was a great price, but he purchased me in order that he might procure food for himself by our common labour. And the thing itself appears to me to require that I should also explain the discipline of this my servitude. In the morning, my master was accustomed to drive me to the next city, laden with many herbs, and after he parted with them for a certain sum of money, to those who sold them to others, he thus returned to his garden, sitting on my back. But while he was digging and watering and performing other rural works in a bent position, I, in the meantime, being at leisure, refreshed myself with placid quiet. Behold, however, the year running back through the number of days and months, by orderly and established circulations of the stars, had descended to the wintry frosts of Capricorn after the pleasures of the vintages of autumn. But I was tormented by continual cold through the daily rains and the nightly dews, being exposed to the open air and shut up in an uncovered stable. For my master, on account of his great poverty, could not purchase, even for himself, and much less for me, some straw or a small covering, but he lived contented with the leafy umbrage which his little cottage afforded. Besides this, also, in the morning I endured great labour in walking with unshod feet on excessively cold clay and pieces of very sharp ice, and was not able to fill my belly with my accustomed food. For both my master and myself had an equal and similar supper, and it was very slender, since it consisted of old and unsavoury lettuces, which having, through the great age of the seeds, grown into an irregular height, like long brooms, had degenerated into the bitter putridity of muddy juice. On a certain night, the master of a family of the next village, being impeded by the darkness of a moonless night, and wet through a heavy shower of rain, and in consequence of this prevented from pursuing his journey in the direct road, turned out of the way, with his now wearied horse, to our garden. And being as courteously received as the time would permit, though not in a delicate, yet in a necessary succour of rest, and desiring to remunerate his benignant host, he promised that he would give him from his farm some corn and oil, and besides this 2 caddi of wine. But my master, without delay, proceeded to the village of that master of a family, which was distant from his garden 60 stadia, sitting on my naked back, and bringing with him a little sack and empty bladders. And this journey being now finished, we came to the before-mentioned farm, and there the benignant host immediately gave my master to partake of a sumptuous dinner. while they were exciting each other alternately to drink, a perfectly stupendous prodigy happened to take place. A hen, belonging to a coop in which others were kept, running through the middle area, made a noise with her native clangor, as if she wanted to lay an egg. Her master, beholding her, said, "O good servant, and sufficiently prolific, who for a long time hast nourished us with the eggs which thou hast daily brought forth, now also, as I see, you think about preparing for us a breakfast. And ho, boy," said he, speaking to one of his servants, "let the basket appointed for the hens, when they are about to lay eggs, be placed in the accustomed corner." While the boy was doing what he was ordered to do, the hen, kicking away the bed which had been made for her, as usual, in the basket, brought forth before the very feet of her master a premature offspring, which was portentous of something very dire. For she did not bring forth an egg, such as we know a hen is accustomed to do, but a chicken, perfectly furnished with feathers and claws, and eyes and voice, and which immediately began to follow its mother. In a similar manner also another prodigy arose, far greater than the former, and at which all men would be justly terrified. For, under the very table which sustained the relics of the dinner, the earth opening itself from the bottom, a most copious fountain of blood burst forth, and many drops rebounding from thence sprinkled the table with gore. At that very moment, likewise, in which all that were present were fixed in astonishment, admiring and trembling at those divine portents, one of the servants ran from the wine cellar, announcing that all the wine, which had long ago been deposited in it, boiled up in all the vessels with a fervent heat, and just as if a large fire had been put under it. In the meantime, also, weasels were seen out of the house, drawing into it a dead serpent. A small green frog leaped out of the mouth of a shepherd's dog, and a ram, rushing on the dog which stood near him, strangled him by one bite. These prodigies, so many and so great, produced an extreme stupor, with great fear, in the minds of the master of that house and all of his family, so that they knew not what should be done first or last, what would more or what would less appease the anger of the gods, or how many and what kinds of expiatory victims should be procured. And while all of them were still torpid through the expectation of some most horrible subject of fear, a certain little servant came running and announced to the master the great and extreme destruction of his family, for he lived full of glory through having 3 sons, now adult, furnished with learning and endued with modesty. Between these young men and a certain poor man, the master of a small cottage, there was an ancient familiarity. But a powerful, rich, and young neighbor, and who badly used the renown of his ancestors' race, possessed ample and fertile fields contiguous to that small cottage. And as he was powerful in the number of his dependents, and easily accomplished in the city whatever he pleased, he behaved in a very hostile manner to a poor man who was his neighbor, by killing his sheep, taking away his oxen, and trampling on his corn before it was ripe. When also he had now entirely deprived him of the product of his labor, he likewise desired to expel him from the possession of his farm, and, exciting a frivolous controversy about the boundaries of the fields, he vindicated the whole of the land to himself. Then that rustic, who was otherwise a simple, harmless man, seeing himself plundered through the avarice of a rich man, in order that he might at least retain enough of his paternal land for a sepulchre, collected together, with great trepidation, many friends, for the purpose of demonstrating to them what were the boundaries of his land. Among others, those 3 brothers were present, affording some small assistance to the great misfortune of their friend. Nevertheless, the insanely furious rich man, not being in the least terrified or even confused by the presence of many citizens, not only was unwilling to abstain from rapine, but also from intemperance of language. For when they mildly expostulated with him, and endeavoured to mitigate his fierce manners by soothing words, He, immediately swearing most sacredly by his own safety and that of his friends, asserted that he considered the presence of so many mediators to be a thing of small consequence, and lastly, that he would order his servants to take that neighbour of his by the ears and expel him to a great distance from his little cottage, and that this should be done immediately. When he had thus said, the greatest indignation was excited in the minds of all that heard him. Then one of the three brothers answered without delay, and a little more freely, that he, in vain trusting to his riches, threatened with tyrannic pride, since the poor also are accustomed to be avenged of the insolence of the rich, through the liberal aid afforded by the laws. Such as oil is to flame, sulphur to burning, and a whip to the furies, such was the fuel of these words to this furious man. And now, being insensate even to extreme insanity, and proclaiming that he would send all of them, and their laws too, to be hanged, he ordered the shepherds' dogs to be liberated, and also the mastiffs, that were fierce and cruel, and accustomed to feed on the dead bodies that were thrown into the fields, and besides this, were nourished by the bites with which they everywhere lacerated the passing traveller. And he likewise commanded that they should be urged to the destruction of the men that were present. But these, as soon as by the accustomed signal of the shepherds they were excited and inflamed, rushed on the men with furious rage, being at the same time horrible by their dissonant barking, and attacking, they pluck their flesh and lacerate them with various wounds, nor did they even spare them while they fled, but being more irritated by their flight, more eagerly pursued them. Then, among the condensed slaughter of a trembling and flying multitude, the youngest of the three brothers stumbled against a stone, and having bruised his fingers, was thrown on the ground, and furnished a nefarious feast to those cruel and most ferocious dogs. For immediately, having found a prostrate prey, they tore in pieces the miserable young man, and as soon as the rest of his brothers knew that he was dying, by his piercing cries, they ran, overwhelmed with sorrow, to give him assistance, and rolling their garments about their left hands, they strived to defend their brother, and to drive off the dogs by throwing at them many stones. They could not, however, either terrify or vanquish their ferocity, for the miserable young man, being torn in pieces, immediately died, entreating with his last words that they would revenge the death of their youngest brother on that most filthy rich man. Then the two remaining brothers, not by Hercules so much despairing of as voluntarily neglecting their own safety, hastily attacked the wealthy man, and hurled many stones at him with great ardour and a furious impetus. But the bloody murderer, who prior to this had been exercised in many similar abominable deeds, throwing a lance, pierced one of the two brothers through the middle of the breast. Yet the young man did not fall on the ground, though he was slain and perfectly lifeless, for the lance, which had penetrated through him, and the greater part of which came out at his back, was by the violence of the impulse fixed in the earth, and kept his body suspended by its firmness and rigidity. But one of the servants also, who was tall and robust, giving assistance to that homicide, sent from afar a stone with great force at the right arm of the third brother. But the stone, passing through the extremities of his fingers with a vain impetus, fell to the ground innoxious, contrary to the opinion of all that were present. Nevertheless, this milder event administered to the most sagacious young man some hope of revenge, for, pretending that his hand was debilitated by the blow, he thus addressed the most cruel wealthy man: "Enjoy the destruction of the whole of our family. Feed your insatiable cruelty with the blood of three brothers, and triumph gloriously over your prostrate citizens. Only remember that you will always have some neighbour, though you may give a still greater and greater extent to the boundaries of your lands. For this my right hand, which would have entirely cut off your head, now being bruised, is rendered incapable of effecting this through the iniquity of fate." The furious thief, being exasperated by this speech, seizing a sword, rushed on the most miserable young man, intending to slay him with his own hand. He did not, however, attack one who was weaker than himself, for the young man, unexpectedly resisting, and far contrary to his opinion, seized his right hand with a most strong embrace, and brandishing the sword with a great effort, expelled the impure soul of the rich man by many and frequent blows. and that he might also liberate himself from the hands of his domestics, who were running to the assistance of their master, he immediately cut his throat with the sword which was yet sprinkled with the blood of his enemy. These were the things which the before mentioned astonishing prodigies had foreshown, and these were the circumstances which were narrated to the most miserable master. Nor could the old man, surrounded by so many evils, utter any word, or even silently weep, but, seizing the knife with which he had then divided among his guests the cheese and other parts of the dinner, he also sorely wounded his own throat with many stabs, in imitation of his most unhappy son, till, falling prone on the table, he washed away with a river of new blood the stains of that portentous blood which suddenly burst forth from the earth. The gardener, commiserating the fate of that house, which was after this manner destroyed in the shortest space of time, and grievously deploring the cruel events which had taken place, and also paying for his dinner with tears, and frequently striking together his empty hands, he immediately got on my back and returned through the road by which we came. His return, however, was not at least innoxious to him, for a certain tall man, who was a legionary soldier, as his dress and appearance indicated, meeting us on the road, asked the gardener, in proud and arrogant language, whither he was leading an empty ass. But my master, who was yet full of grief, and besides this was ignorant of the Latin tongue, silently passed by him. The soldier, therefore, being indignant at his silence, as a mark of contempt, thrust him from my back, at the same time striking him with the branch of a vine which he held in his hand. Then the gardener suppliantly answered that he could not know what he said through his ignorance of the Latin tongue. The soldier, therefore, subjoining in Greek, said, "Whither do you lead this ass?" The gardener answered that he was going to the next city. "But I," said the soldier, "am in want of its assistance, for it is requisite that it should carry from the neighbouring little town, with other labouring beasts, the baggage of our prefect." And immediately laying hold of the rope by which I was led, he began to draw me along. But the gardener, wiping away the blood which trickled from his head through the wound of the former blow, again entreated the soldier to act by him more humanely and mildly, and this he did, conjuring him by his prosperous hopes. "For this ass," said he, "is sluggish, and besides this frequently falls to that detestable disease epilepsy, and it is with great difficulty that he usually carries a few bundles of herbs from a neighbouring garden, and in doing this he is fatigued, and his respiration is languid. So far is he from being adapted to carry larger burdens." After perceiving, however, that the soldier could not be appeased by any prayers, but was in a greater degree incited to his destruction, and that now, having inverted the vine branch, he was preparing to fracture his skull with a larger knot of the branch, he fled to his last resource, and, feigning that he wished to embrace his knees, in order to excite his compassion, he inclined and bent himself, and, taking hold of both his feet, lifted him up, and violently dashed him to the ground. Immediately afterwards, likewise, he struck every part of his face, his hands, and his sides, at one time with his fists, at another with his elbows, and besides this he bit him, and beat him with a stone taken up in the road. Nor could the soldier either resist or by any means defend himself after he was laid prostrate on the ground, but could only frequently threaten that if he rose again, he would cut him in pieces with his sword. The gardener, being admonished by these words, snatched the sword from him, and throwing it to a great distance, again attacked him with severer blows. But the soldier, being prostrate and prevented by wounds from defending himself, as he could not find any other means of safety, feigned that he was dead, which was the only thing that remained for him to do. Then the gardener, taking with him that sword, got on my back, and proceeded rapidly in a direct line to the city, and, not even thinking of at least visiting his own garden, he betook himself to a certain person with whom he was familiarly acquainted, and having narrated to this friend everything which had happened to him, he implored his assistance in his present dangerous situation, and requested that he would conceal him and his ass for some time, till he had escaped a capital indictment by being latent for 2 or 3 days. But this acquaintance, not being forgetful of ancient friendship, promptly received him, and having drawn me, my legs being folded together, by means of a ladder into the highest room of the house, the gardener crept into a certain chest that was in the cellar, and covering himself over with the lid of it, there lay concealed. The soldier, however, as I afterwards learnt, being at length roused, as if from excessive intoxication, nevertheless staggering and feeble, from the pain of so many wounds, and scarcely able to support himself by a staff, came into the city, and fearing to mention to any one of the citizens any particulars of his violence and inertness, but tacitly devouring the injury he had sustained, when he met with some of his fellow soldiers, he then told them of his misfortune. But they were of opinion that he should conceal himself for some time in their military dwelling, for besides his own proper disgrace, he feared also the military genius who presides over the military oath, on account of the sword which he had lost. They, however, having observed our footsteps, diligently applied themselves to the discovery of us, and to their own revenge. Nor was a perfidious neighbour wanting, who told them that we were there concealed. Then his fellow soldiers went to the magistrates, and pretended that they had lost on the road a very valuable silver vessel belonging to their prefect, and that a certain gardener had found it, and was unwilling to restore it, but was now concealed in the house of a friend. Then the magistrates, becoming acquainted with the loss, and the name of the prefect, came to the gate of our dwelling, and with a loud voice announced to our host that it would be better for him to deliver us up, who were certainly concealed in his house, than to undergo the danger of losing his life. But he, not being in the least terrified, and consulting the safety of him whom he had taken under his protection, did not confess anything concerning us, and asserted that he had not seen that gardener for some days. On the contrary, the soldiers, swearing by the genius of the emperor, affirmed that he was concealed there, and not in any other place. At length, however, the magistrates were determined, by investigation, to confute him in his obstinate denial. Having therefore sent the lictors into his house, and the other public ministers, they ordered them diligently to explore everything in all the corners of the apartments. But they, having searched, declared that no man, nor even the ass itself, were to be found in any part of the house. Then the altercation became more vehement on both sides, on the part of the soldiers, who asserted that we were certainly there, and frequently implored the assistance of Caesar, and on the part of the master of the house, who denied the accusation, and continually called the gods to testify the truth of what he said. I, therefore, who was in other respects an inquisitive ass, and endued with a restless petulance, when I heard the contention and clamorous murmur, was desirous, by looking through a certain window with my neck in an oblique position, to see what was the meaning of that tumult. And while I was so doing, one of the soldiers, having by chance turned his eyes to my shadow, called all of them to be witnesses of it publicly. Lastly, a great clamour was presently raised, and certain persons immediately coming to me by the assistance of ladders, laid their hands on me, and drew me from the place of my concealment as a captive. And now, without any delay, more carefully exploring everything, and uncovering also the chest, they found the miserable gardener, drew him out from thence, presented him to the magistrates, and led him to a public prison, in order that he might suffer capital punishment. Nor could they refrain from jesting, accompanied with the greatest laughter, at my looking out of the window. Whence also the proverb originated, which is very much used, concerning the inspection and shadow of an ass. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Recording by Thomas Copeland.